me officially welcome everyone to our special for schools today. The title is Migration and Identity, Exploring Personal Journeys and Cultural Encounters. This is part of our ABI preparation that we do for schools. And I'm happy that many of you found your way here to join us for this presentation. My name is Katrin Büttner, and I coordinate the school programs at the DAZ. The DAZ is the Deutsch-Amerikanisches Zentrum, or the German-American Center in Stuttgart. And first, I would like to welcome today's speaker, Lauren Frick. Hi, Lauren.
Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for being here today. I'll introduce you later properly.
Okay.
But, I want to tell everyone a little bit about the DAZ and today's event first. So, for everyone who doesn't know the DAZ, the German American Center is a cultural institution that informs about the United States and fosters German American relations. And in addition to a cultural program where we offer a variety of events like lectures or panel discussions, sometimes we show films, sometimes we have something like a book swap. So we have all kinds of different events. We also offer English classes taught by American teachers like Lauren, for instance. And we also have a library, an English-speaking library. And we also offer advice to teenagers and young adults who are interested in educational opportunities in the United States. So if you are interested in any of these events or things that we offer, just let us know or check out our website and find the information there. Today's event is part of our school program, where we also offer presentations and workshops for school classes or teacher trainings for teachers. And we've already had several online events for students and teachers in the context of the Abitur topic. And the event today is aimed at students who want to prepare for the Abitur, and of course, teachers who are interested in what we're doing here. And I would like to take this opportunity to briefly mention that we will be offering another presentation on April 14th, in which we will be focusing on global perspectives on migration. And last year, we also had an online talk with Sefi Atta, the author of one of the short stories, Green, in which we discussed her story in the context of the Abitur topic. And if you're interested in checking that out, you can find a recording of this talk on our YouTube page. And I will just send a link to everyone in the chat in a few minutes if you want to check that out. So we will also put a recording of this event on our YouTube page afterwards if you want to look at it again or want to take some notes or whatever. Okay, so before we begin, let me also briefly explain how to use Zoom during this presentation, because you cannot turn on your microphones or camera, so you will not be able to just ask us questions, but you have the chance to ask questions at any point of the presentation through the Q&A, or in German, it's the F und A tool. It should be somewhere on your screen, like at the bottom, or I don't know how it is in the app, but you should find it somewhere. And we encourage you to ask many questions, and we will take breaks during the presentation to answer questions. So just, like if there's a question, just type it in whenever it comes up, and we will take breaks in between, and we will also have some time after the presentation for more questions and discussions. So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Lauren Frick. Lauren holds a bachelor's degree in history and did a master's program in international conflict. She has been teaching English for many, many years at the DAZ, and also works as a teacher and speaker for the German American Center. and she is specialized on the Abitur topic and teaching Abi students. So ask her all the questions you have. And Lauren, thank you again for taking on this event today. And I'm happy you're here. And on this note, I'll just hand it over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you guys very much for joining me today. I only have 90 minutes to really talk about a lot of important things that I think will be important for your Abby. So we're just going to jump right in. So what my plan is, what we will discuss is, first of all, kind of like how the short stories portray migration through personal narratives. So what this means is just looking more in depth at the short stories and seeing what their experience was and what influenced it. I would also like to do kind of an overview of some of the important topics related to immigration that you definitely need to be familiar with before your Abby, things like push and pull factors, the American dream, which I know you've already had, but hopefully a nice little refresher before the Abby. And then we will also be analyzing some of the factors that contributed or not to the characters' successful integration, which means, of course, this applies to absolutely kind of all migrants, but specifically looking at our short story characters. Okay, so like I said, let's just jump right in. We have a lot to talk about. Um, we've been hearing a lot in the news, especially the last 10 years or so, about migration. Um, this is absolutely true, but in your head, I want you to think of it as something that has been going on forever. Since the dawn of human history, people have been moving around the planet. The first humans left Africa, what was it, like 60,000 years ago? They entered North America 20,000 years ago. Throughout human history, people have been moving around for the same reasons that they kind of move today. They're searching for better opportunities. They're searching for a safer life or protection from, different conflicts or persecution or the effects of natural disasters. You could kind of argue that it's in our DNA, like as humans, that we move around. We have a beautiful planet, right? Um, so we can understand it very much as like a constant feature throughout history. But of course, there are moments in time where there are waves of migration, also known as like mass migration. So if we look at, the immigration patterns in the United States, for example, we very clearly kind of see what I'm talking about here. So this is a graph that shows us, immigration occurring in waves with peaks, which is like the high point, followed by troughs, which is like a low point. So if we look to, the 19th century, during the frontier expansion period, when the country was being settled and, getting larger, what we see is mainly migrants were coming over from Northern and Western Europe, so England and Ireland, Scotland, Germany is included in this. And then around the turn of the century, we have a peak here in 1907. And this is because this was the age of the Industrial Revolution. Factories were booming and, industry was booming. There was a lot of new opportunities, a lot of new jobs. So during this time period, we had a lot of migrants coming from mostly like Southern and Eastern Europe, so Italy, Spain, etc. So this is when we have a peak. And then if you look around here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, 1929, we have a trough, like a low point. And if you guys like history the way that I do, you will know what happened in 1929, which is the beginning of the Great Depression. So during the Depression and then later leading into the war years, very, very low immigration rates. It started picking up again in the 50s and the 60s. And since about 1965, what we see is kind of a pretty steady increase. What's notable about post-1965 immigration is that it has mostly been coming from Asian countries, so Chinese, Filipino, and Latin America, so Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras. These are usually the top countries sending migrants. And so, if we look at America today, if you look at, do the numbers, and it's like 350 million Americans approximately. And if you look at the whole population, it's about 14% of foreign born. So 14% were born in a country outside of the United States, but live in the United States. But of course, it's important to remember that America, every single one of us has some kind of immigration background at some point in their history, right? We all came over, with the notable exception, of course, of being a Native American. But most Americans came over at some point, right, through these immigration phases. And that's exactly why we are called, like a nation of immigrants. So looking today, what's going on today? Modern society. So to take your Abby title, modern society is on the move. And this is very much because of globalization. First of all, it's this process of the world getting smaller and more connected. And technology is a critical component of that. So, for example, if I wanted to, I could apply online, thanks to technology, to teach English in Japan. And probably within a few weeks, I could be on a plane going to Japan to work and live for the next couple of years, or however long I want, right? Thanks to globalization and technology. People are just more able to move around the planet than they were in the past. There's more opportunities with access to the internet. And also just think about how infrastructure, like how easy it is nowadays to move around the planet. If you have the money to do it, you could be on a plane. It's a little too late now. It's, almost 5 in the afternoon, but let's say tomorrow morning, you could take a plane to the US and you would be there 8 hours later. I mean, easy, right? Think about 100 years ago. If you wanted to go to the United States, you would have to endure what, like a 2-3 week journey across the ocean, across the Atlantic on a ship. Nowadays it's like we take it for granted just because in our lives we've always had this. But, the first transatlantic flight wasn't even until 1939. It's been less than 100 years since we've really had the ability to move like we do now. So just, yeah, keep that in mind. So if we look overall at the numbers from 2020, we have about 280 million global migrants. So that means 280 million people around the planet are living in a country outside of their birth. If we look at that number in terms of population, then it's going to be the fourth largest country, if it was a country. So number one is India, which has recently overtaken China. So India, China, the United States, and then if global migrants were a country, they would be in fourth place. That's how many there are. Okay, so one last graph for you. This is, sorry, it's actually a bar chart. And so what you see here is on the vertical y-axis, you see the percent of global migration, like the share of the global population. And then on the x horizontal axis, you see the decades, right? And so what we can take away from this is just a worldwide kind of strong growth over the past several decades of global migrants. And most importantly, This trend is forecasted to continue. So this is a topic that will remain very, very relevant. Okay, let's take a quick look at different vocabulary terms related to migration. So the first one is just migrant. Like whenever you're struggling to think like, oh, what word should I use? Just always use migrant. It's a safe bet. It's neutral. And it really just means kind of anybody who has left their home and is living in a different place. Of course, there's many different kind of subcategories. You can have an economic migrant or a seasonal migrant. But this is, yeah, just always your safe term. Then we have irregular or undocumented migration. And this is somebody who has entered a new country, crossed a border without the proper or official documentation. And what's interesting about this term, which you might have been hearing about in the news, is that, it's pretty controversial. There's a lot of debate about what the most appropriate term would be. And basically, it just comes down to your politics in the US, at least. If you listen to, speeches from President Trump or Republicans, they tend to use the term illegal immigration or an illegal immigrant, whereas Democrats, you will hear them mostly saying undocumented. And this might sound kind of silly, like, oh, why are we fighting over a word, right? But the reason why Democrats do not like the term illegal immigration is because they argue that it kind of reinforces the stereotype of criminality, right? Because it's like if you're illegal, then that leads to, oh, you're a criminal. And criminals, what's the stereotype of criminals, right? That they're dangerous, right? So it kind of reinforces that stereotype. So sometimes we have words, wars with words. Did we have a question? Sorry, just to interrupt myself real quick. I thought I saw.
Yes, let me just.
Okay.
It's just if the question if everyone can have access to the PowerPoint presentation.
Oh, okay.
Afterwards. I think we cannot do that for various reasons, but as I said, we will have the recording of this or last year's presentation, which is similar, online. So you will have the chance to look at the event or the presentation afterwards again, and we can let you know. We can also send you the link as soon as we have it to everyone who's here today. So just to answer that question.
Okay, thanks. I just see the chat button go up, and then I'm like, what's happening? Okay, so our next one is we have immigration with an E and immigration with an I. So this is just a difference with prepositions. So if you say the family immigrated from England, then you need E. And then if it's they immigrated like to North America, then it's going to be immigration with an I. So just which country they are going to or coming from is the difference. Go. Okay. Another word that perhaps you guys have not heard before, an expatriate or an expat for short. So this is the term used for like immigrants who have moved from kind of one wealthy, predominantly white country to another wealthy, predominantly white country. So for example, expats, you hear a lot of, expats coming from like the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Now, just kind of like, illegal immigration, this is a kind of controversial term because it's stereotyping the people coming from these countries as having privilege, having money, being predominantly white. And instead of using the term immigrant, which again has that stereotype of typically being like poor in need, right? Is this fair? Probably not, right? I mean, I am an American living in Germany. I do tend to call myself an expat, but at the heart of it, I'm just an immigrant, right? That's what we all are. So just so you're aware of that term. And then lastly, what I would like to do is talk for a second about the difference between an asylum seeker and a refugee, because sometimes we use these interchangeably without really knowing the difference. So first of all, an asylum seeker is anybody who has left their country and is seeking protection in another country, either because of persecution or human rights violations. But the difference is that they are still going through the process. And as we know from A Soldier's Tale in our short stories, that this can be a very, very long process. So asylum seekers are those who are still in the process. They have not had a decision made about their asylum claim yet. But it is important to remember that seeking asylum, this is a human right, an internationally recognized human right since 1948, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights passed by the United Nations. So refugees, on the other hand, are people who have gone through that process and they have been granted official status. So at the end of Soldier's Tale, we have the man who was processing the applications decide to grant Salim official refugee status. But what we also learn from that tale is that not every asylum seeker becomes a refugee. Indeed, most asylum seeker applications are turned down, right? Because there's so many. So hopefully that's clear then what the difference is. Okay, I know you guys have had this in school before, but just as a little refresher, what are some push and pull factors? So push factors, it's all the things that force people out of a country. So war, famine, when there's not enough food, drought, when there's not enough water, political, religious persecution, political instability, poverty, not enough money, lack of quality education or job opportunities, things like this. And then we have pull factors. What attracts people to a new country? Well, political stability, freedom of religion and speech, higher income, right? More money, more better, better working opportunities and conditions, and then access to quality education are important. So let's look more in depth at the short story collection and look at these push and pull factors. So the first one, exterior paint. If you guys remember, our protagonist, Alphonse, he immigrates from St. Kitts in the Caribbean to England in 1965, which is important because he is a part of what's known as the Windrush generation. I'm not sure if you guys had a lesson about this in school. If not, I'll just quickly summarize it. So what happened was, in the post-war years in England, they needed workers. And so there was an act passed in England in 1948 that said, our colonies have the right, like people from our colonies, like the Caribbean, they have the right to come and live and work in the United Kingdom because, they needed workers. So they said, kind of please come, right? So it was about 500,000 people from the Caribbean between like 1948 and I think it went to like 1971 or something like that. 500,000 Caribbean people came over to England, and when they landed, the Home Office, who's in charge of immigration, they didn't give them any kind of documentation saying like, you have the right to be here because they were treated as British subjects. So they had no kind of documentation because they didn't need it. And now, fast forward to 2018, and this suddenly becomes a giant scandal because thousands of people who were part of this Windrush generation, they were sent letters threatening deportation. Um, they were wrongfully detained, and their descendants as well, because they said, hey, you have no proof that you legally came to the United Kingdom. And they said, what? How can this be? Right. So it became a huge scandal. And it's been resolved in the courts. They now have the right to continue to stay there. Um, but yeah, it was a huge scandal and very embarrassing for the UK Home Office. Okay, so Alphonse, he was a part of that. We don't really learn in the story exactly why he left the Caribbean, but we can assume he moved to England in search of these, kind of better job opportunities. And then looking at the short story Green, um, we have two very highly educated parents, and they moved to Mississippi from Nigeria. We'll talk more about Nigeria in a moment, but basically the kind of push factors are that there is a very high unemployment rate, particularly around the youth. Young people struggle to get jobs. It was something like 43% youth unemployment rate in Nigeria, which is, shockingly high. There are low salaries. And so, especially young people, they're on the move. They're trying to find more opportunity to take care of their families. Political corruption in Nigeria is also an issue. So there is quite a large number of migrants leaving Nigeria. Um, so then we have The Thing Around Your Neck, who Akuna, our protagonist, she was also born in Nigeria. So we have two stories from Nigeria. And she received the green card to move to Maine. Loose Change, if you guys remember, it is Layla and her brother, and they fled Uzbekistan, which is a former Soviet republic. And Uzbekistan, it's under an authoritarian government. There is a really harsh crackdown on kind of democratic values like freedom of speech, freedom of the press. And her parents, if you guys remember, worked as journalists. So they had to, they were arrested, and then Layla and her brother had to flee. And then we have the Embassy of Cambodia. So our protagonist was born in the Ivory Coast. Again, we have a country that has serious human rights abuses. There was a civil war going from 2002 until I think 2007. So around the time that our protagonist would have been born, or a child, sorry, because the story takes place during the London Olympics in 2012. So our protagonist would have been a child at this point. And then we find out she moves to Ghana. And then 2 years later, her father arranged her difficult passage from Libya to Italy. And so what I immediately kind of thought of when I read that term, like that phrase, her difficult passage, what I thought was, okay, she did a migrant boat crossing from Africa to Italy. So let's assume that she was on a boat. And then A Soldier's Tale, like I mentioned before, Salim, he was born in Eritrea. I don't know if you guys know anything about Eritrea. Quite honestly, I did not before I read this short story, and then I did some research into it. And frankly, I was pretty shocked. Eritrea is a very difficult country. It has been under a dictatorship since 1993. There have been no elections since 1993. There are extreme human rights abuses and violations. Um, There's widespread forced labor and conscription, and that's what Salim talks about in the short story. And if you guys don't know that term conscription, it means like when you're forced to join the military and you have to fight in the war, which is what happens to our protagonist here. And then lastly, we have Southside Raza. And Shadow, he was brought undocumented to the US as a baby from Tijuana, Mexico. And Tijuana is one of the most dangerous cities in Mexico. And this is because there's a lot of fighting between different crime groups for different like cartels for control of drug trafficking routes. So all of these, like the examples I just gave you, were all push factors for our protagonists in the short stories to leave their home countries. Oh, sorry, I missed one. The third and final continent, he leaves India, right? He first moved to London and then to Boston. So India does have kind of a booming market in certain sectors. However, there's a giant population, right? They've just overtaken China as being the most populous country in the world. And so what that leads to is high rates of pollution. The quality education is not really there. Um, Basically just too many people and not enough jobs. So you have a large number of Indians who are leaving in search of better opportunities in Europe and the United States and Canada, for example. Okay. Now, I know you guys have had this before, but let's do a quick review. The American dream, right? It's a major pull factor. What attracts people to migrate to the United States? So what is it? Well, very quickly, what it is this idea that in the United States, and keep in mind, like when the country was first founded in the 18th century, what it said was, hey, Europe, we kind of reject this idea of like a social hierarchy, right? This idea that if you're born a peasant, you're going to die a peasant, or if you're born wealthy, you're going to die wealthy. We reject this idea, and instead, we're going to build a country based solely on equality of opportunity so that everybody theoretically, keep it theoretically, has the same opportunities. And the only thing that matters is how hard you work. So the key word that I want you guys to remember is social mobility, the ability to climb in society, to go, maybe you were born a peasant, but because you worked hard, you were able to build a successful, wealthy life. So, the term dishwasher to millionaire, it just means basically that there should be theoretically no obstacles in your way, except how hard you decide to work. So equality of opportunity and upward social mobility. But like we know, there are many, many challenges present to achieving this dream, especially nowadays. I have a whole kind of lesson about this if you guys ever come to my Abby classes, but quickly, the main challenge nowadays is just I would say probably the high cost of education. In order to succeed, in order to build wealth, typically you have to get a university degree and then you get a good job, right? You get a good salary. But nowadays, it's extremely expensive to go to university, to get that education. So that equality of opportunity is not really there, right? Similarly, we have, like you guys know, a problem with racism in the United States. And what we see when we look at the facts and the data is that minorities have a harder time achieving the American dream, for all these reasons. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So, the shortest lesson you'll ever get about the American dream. Okay, so what is the symbol for freedom and immigration in the United States? Hopefully, in your head, you answered the Statue of Liberty, right? So this is, I mean, most of you probably have already had your oral exam at this point, but if you ever see this, like in a cartoon especially, I want you to immediately start thinking immigration because it's really used often as a symbol for immigration. And this is because this is right next to like Ellis Island, which was the main immigration processing center in the 19th and 20th centuries for immigrants. So the Statue of Liberty was the first thing that these newly arrived migrants saw when they approached New York Harbor. And at the base of the statue, there's a very famous quote. There's a poem um, from Emma Lazarus, and it's called The New Colossus. And the famous part that everybody kind of knows, at least Americans know, is it says, "Give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." Right? So it's this kind of idea that like here in the new world, here in America, like we will take all of these people from around the world. You're tired, you're poor. Bring them to us. We want the people who want to live in freedom, right? Yearning to breathe free. Come to us. And then also, our official motto in the United States is one of the only Latin phrases that I know is E pluribus unum, right? Which means from many, one, which is a beautiful kind of sentiment, right? This is on our money, this motto. So you see the way that, kind of our history, this nation of immigrants has been kind of shown. This is our history, right? So looking towards, again, towards our short stories, how do we see the American dream in our short stories? Well, first of all, the thing around your neck, right in the beginning, she talks about after she won the green card lottery, she talks about like her aunts and uncles saying, "Oh, you're moving to America, and within a few weeks or months, you're gonna have a big house and you're gonna have a big car." But then I had to laugh in the short story. It was like, "But don't buy a gun like those Americans." So it's, this kind of stereotypical vision of what America means, what the American dream means. Big car, big house, right? But unfortunately for Acuna, her plans got derailed because of her uncle. And so she was planning to go to community college, but then she had to leave her uncle's home. And then she started working as a waitress, which meant that she could not afford to go to school. So her American dream really never materialized. Now, if we can, compare and contrast that to the third and final continent, he arrived in the United States already very highly educated. He came over because he got a job at MIT in Boston, which, with Harvard is, an extremely, extremely prestigious school. And so, at the end of the short story, he talks about how he and his wife, they can afford to buy a home. And then the quote is, "On a tree-lined street with room for guests and a garden." And then he sends his son to Harvard, right? So he is our prime example of somebody who absolutely achieves the American dream. And then always think of the thing around your neck as kind of the opposite of that, the antithesis. We have somebody who it went horribly wrong and somebody who absolutely succeeded in it. Okay, let's talk for a second about the difference between the melting pot and the salad bowl. And again, I know that you guys have had this before, but it's worth repeating. So, the melting pot. This refers to the idea of like cultural assimilation. It's this idea that when you move to a place like the United States, we want you to kind of give up your past heritage, your past culture, and we're going to melt you down and mix you in this bowl. And what comes out of this bowl is just one large kind of American culture. Um, this is, yeah, assimilation, giving up your past in order to fit into the new culture. Now, compare that with this idea of multiculturalism or the salad bowl. Now, this is different because it's kind of like, all right, we're all in this big bowl together, right? But we can see, oh, this tomato is red, right? The lettuce is green. My cucumber is green. Okay, I should have picked a different color vegetable. Um, my mushroom is gray. Okay, I'm picking terrible examples. But you see what I mean? Like that everybody's in the same bowl, but it's still distinctly kind of recognizable. Every ingredient is distinguishable and valuable to the whole. So nowadays, sociologists they kind of prefer to talk about the salad bowl idea. It means that immigrants can keep their ethnic and cultural background or identities. So yeah, two different kind of ideas about how integration can or should work. Okay, guys, so what I would do now, if you guys don't have any questions, and like I said, please feel free at any point to stop me, because I know sometimes I move a mile a minute. But what I would do now is talk about some of the factors that helped our migrants in our short stories, but indeed, kind of talking generally about all migrants, how they're able to successfully integrate or not into their new country. So the first factor is finding that balance. Like we were just talking about this multiculturalism salad bowl idea, finding that balance between old and new cultures and not losing your identity. Um, First of all, what is identity? Okay. Well, you know, quite simply, it just answers the question like, who am I? Who am I? It seems like such an easy question, but the more you think about it, the more kind of complex it becomes, right? Who am I? Well, I'm this, I'm this, I'm this, I'm this. And what's interesting to note is that, this answer is going to be different for everybody. And some factors are more important for others than other factors. It could be the language that you speak. It could be the country that you are from. It could be, your traditions or your religion, your family background, your career, your family, all these different kind of factors. What's happening in the United States that I've noticed over the last, 10 years or so is that your political identity is becoming increasingly more important. It's kind of like at the top of the list. It's like when you meet somebody new nowadays, it's like, are you Republican? Are you Democrat? Where are you politically? And that kind of, in past generations, it was never really a thing. Um, so what's important to remember about identity is that, it's not fixed. The way that you identify at the age of, 6, like my little son, he's actually he's 7, I lied, sorry. Oh, he just had a birthday. So if I ask him, like, who are you? Who are you? He's gonna say, I'm Alex. I'm 7 and I'm a boy. It's like these are the factors that for him are the most important, right? But if you ask somebody your age, right, 17, 18, 19, you will probably tell me something totally different. If you ask somebody my age who's 41, it's going to be, okay, I'm a mom, I'm a teacher, I'm an American, right? So it's going to change. And that's a good thing because we need our identity to change. That means that we're experiencing life, right? And that we're evolving. All right, yeah. Before I go on my long, I can talk about this topic for like 30 minutes, but I'll stop myself. Okay, so that's the most important factors. And then we also have to go from kind of personal identity to this concept of national identity. You know, what does it mean to be German? What does it mean to be American? So what we can kind of the short story is that we can identify for sure a distinct culture. There's certainly a distinct language. You know, I think you would probably all agree, like, that Germans speak German, right? Germans have a shared history. There are shared tradition. There's a rich culture. You know, things like Christmas markets, right? This is an example of national identity. And it's also just kind of like values that a country holds. And of course, you know, we have to be careful not to slip into like stereotyping, but it is indeed possible to like kind of identify these shared factors that make a country and its people what it is. Music, food, you know, all aspects of culture are included in national identity. And again, kind of the trend over the last 10 years, what we're seeing more and more in certain countries like the United States to, you know, Germany to a certain extent is this kind of debate in society about who qualifies as an American, like who are the real Americans, right? And increasingly, you know, President Trump's argument and his supporters' argument is that like kind of newly arrived immigrants are not included in this definition of like, are you a real American? Are you a part of American society and culture? So it's this big kind of existential question that has real world implications, right? Are you included in the country or not? So again, going back to our short stories, Green, I think, is a really nice example of her parents of them finding a really nice cultural balance. You know, they talk about um, eating food from Nigeria, and even though the daughter doesn't like it, uh, picking the bones, I think it was the chicken bones. This is them as Nigerian immigrants living in America and keeping their history, keeping their culture, keeping the food that they like to eat, right? Combined with going to the daughter's soccer games and getting mad about politics, you know, which is like very American, right? So it's finding that balance of this kind of multiculturalism in the salad bowl idea. And then in the third and final continent, you know, the same could be said. Our protagonist, I had a little laugh to myself when I read that he likes to eat cornflakes every morning for breakfast, because to me, this is just like the most American breakfast ever. Like, have a bowl of cornflakes, throw in a banana, and you got a healthy, a healthy meal. But at the same time, you know, he's in an arranged marriage, which is very, you know, Indian, right? So he finds that kind of balance somehow. Okay, the second factor is finding a sense of belonging through personal relationships. So if you guys have seen this pyramid before, it's called the hierarchy of needs. It was created by, I think in the 1950s, by an American psychologist, Dr. Maslow. And what he said basically is that we as human beings, that we all have a hierarchy of needs. And the theory goes that in order to kind of move up the pyramid, you have to start at the base. And if your base needs are met, then you can move up to the second level. If your second level is met, you can move up to the third, third to fourth, fourth to fifth, etc. So what he says is that like all human beings, our very first basic need is our physiological need. So what that means is we need to eat, we need to drink water, we need to have warmth when it's cold, we need to sleep, right? So if we have that, then we move up to our safety needs, which is the need to have a feeling of security, a feeling of safety. Um, and then we get to the one for our purposes, which I would say is probably the most important for our short stories, is we as human beings need to feel belonging. We need to feel that there are other people in our lives, our family or our friends. It doesn't have to be romantic, but we need other people in our lives that we feel accept us for who we are. There's a very famous quote that I use sometimes in my when I'm doing examples of writing for the Abbey. And I love this quote. It says, "No man is an island," right? No man is an island. It's like, if you understand the metaphor, it's like we all need to kind of like touch others, right? To have the the belonging that comes from friends and family or intimate relationships. And we'll analyze that in just a second. And then just to quickly finish our pyramid, if you have that, then the theory goes you can move up to the next level, which is your esteem needs, which is basically just, we need to feel proud of ourselves. We need to have a feeling of accomplishment, that we're contributing something to this world. We just need to feel good about ourselves, right? And then lastly, it's like, if all these needs are met, then we can self-actualize, which is like us becoming the best version of ourselves possible. And you can fulfill your potential. So it's just a theory, but um, this belonging is clearly critical when analyzing our short stories. Think about going back to Exterior Paint. Think about Alphonse. He was living in 1965 Britain, right? He faced active discrimination from all of, maybe not all, but most of his neighbors, right? Saying, "Oh, we don't want blacks here. Go back where you came from." But he found his great love, right? He found one person, Lillian, who loved him and accepted him for who he was. And because of her, he was able to find that belonging. And therefore, we assume live a happy, long life in England, right? Like he stayed for her, kind of. The little girl in green, she has, from what we learn, it seems like she has, a lot of friends in school, on her soccer team. She feels that kind of belonging in her community. Southside Raza, it's very much a blend of kind of like Mexican and American culture. Shadow identifies as an American. Indeed, he doesn't realize that he is undocumented, which was a tragic ending. We'll talk more about that later. And then, so these are kind of like our positive examples. And then our negative examples, the thing around your neck. Akuna, she's so isolated. She doesn't feel understood. She doesn't feel accepted. She talks about, the people and the customers in the restaurant. Um, they ask her these dumb questions like, "Oh, are there cars in Africa? Or did you Do you have real houses back in Africa? Like she doesn't have anybody. Like her uncle, who was supposed to be her support system, turns out, he was a total creeper. And so she had to leave there. Her boyfriend, um, she doesn't feel like she can, truly be herself. So she kind of has nobody. She is that island that I was talking about. She feels like an island. And in return, what's the effect that it has on her? She feels depressed. She feels anxious. She wants to return home, which she does, right? Okay. Our third factor, very important, is language, right? It's like if you want to live in a new place, you need to learn the language. I tell myself that with German all the time. So, and indeed, this is considered really the most critical factor for belonging. I put this poll up here, which I thought was really interesting. This was from the Pew Research Center in 2020, and it surveyed different countries. So we have Germany, France, the UK, and the US here. And they asked the question, you know, what, which factor is very or somewhat important for truly belonging to the country? And so what do we see here? 76% of Germans said being able to speak German is a critical factor in belonging, the most important factor in belonging. In second place, we have sharing the country's customs and traditions. 30% said that that was critical. Less to a much, less extent, we have being born in the country and then sharing their religion, being a Christian at 11%. So it's interesting, but language clearly, just in a practical sense, you have to be able to communicate. You need to be able to, go to the doctor, go grocery shopping. The kids need to go to school. This is, quite obviously huge. And that's exactly what we start to really depict and analyze in the film Arrival. I mean, this film is all about the difficulties that arise when you don't speak the same language. Um, it can lead very clearly to misunderstanding, to prejudice. Um, when the aliens arrive on Earth in the film, remember, it's like nobody could understand them. And so how did most countries react? Like Russia and China, parts of the US military, they all, responded like with a lot of aggression and said like, they're here to attack us. We don't trust them, right? But as soon as that language barrier was broke with Dr. Banks, then suddenly there's an understanding, right? And it led to kind of a beautiful ending for Dr. Banks. We're going to talk more about Arrival in a second because it's pretty important. But again, with A Soldier's Tale, we see this lesson of not being able to speak the language and how difficult it was for him. He describes living homeless on the streets in Italy, and he spoke no Italian, just that inability to not communicate was a serious detriment, which is like a big obstacle to ever having the hope of feeling, at home or settled in a new country. Our fourth factor is has to do with money. It has to do with your work. The characters who had um, fixed kind of middle class American dream kind of salaries with good jobs tended to do better. The highly educated, they had financial security. So again, going back to Green, these are very highly educated parents. The mother is working as a university lecturer, and the father is a doctor, right? So they are, living that kind of American dream. Third and final continent as well. Like I told you before, he's working at MIT. He's highly educated. Now, the flip side, compare that to like the Embassy of Cambodia. She is not valued at all for her work. She's working as a nanny or a childminder. She actually questions whether she's living in modern slavery because they took her passport from her. And, I really don't want to be pessimistic and say like that it's all just about money and how much money you earn. Um, it's also, I mean, that's clearly a factor, especially, when you look at the cold hard facts of how much the American dream costs nowadays. But it's also to do with just like how you feel about your work. If you feel like your work is meaningful, being a nanny is a really important job. I worked as a nanny in France for a couple of years. It's a really important job, but unfortunately, it's not paid very well, right? And that tends to be the difference. And she does not feel valued at all for her work. The same with Akuna, right? And the thing around your neck. She is working as a waitress, and the work is unfulfilling for her. She doesn't feel good. She doesn't have that kind of esteem needs, going back to our pyramid. She doesn't feel good about it. And then in A Soldier's Tale, we have the really strong example of he is not working at all. He's reduced to begging on the streets, which he hates. Um, Right. So jobs, salary plays a huge impact. It has a huge impact. And then the last, but I would argue maybe most important factor is how they are treated in their communities. So what we're going to see, what we can summarize when we look at all the short stories as a whole, is that the migrants and our characters who were treated well by either their communities or by at least some people in their communities, they had a more successful experience than those who were treated with suspicion and stereotypes and prejudice. So, before we do that, the most important terms that I want you guys to take away, because in my opinion, this is really like the most important part of the Abby lessons from the film and the short stories, is this concept of like othering versus bridging. So othering is when, we have a cross-cultural encounter with somebody and we approach this encounter with kind of like suspicion, with disinterest, with prejudice. And we're kind of saying like, ugh, like you're in this group and I'm in this group. It's kind of like what I was saying earlier about like who are the real like Americans. It's kind of like I am an American and you're not. And I don't want to mix with you, right? So this is kind of othering. The alternative approach to a cross-cultural encounter is that we can bridge. We can be open, we can be interested, and we can try to learn and communicate with the foreigner. And in doing so, typically, it will lead to a positive encounter, not only for the foreigner, but for you as well. And that's exactly the lesson learned in Arrival, right? Dr. Banks literally goes into the spaceship and approaches these aliens. And instead of reacting with like, fear and like, oh, you're here to attack us and we hate you, get out of here, she approaches them with an openness and a willingness to learn. And in return, she goes through the process of having this encounter. And in return, she learned their language, which was a gift, right? She learned to see time the way that these aliens could. That was a gift. That is bridging. Now, Russia and China, the way that they reacted, giving the ultimatum of, you have to leave within, what was it, like 3 days or something. If you don't leave, we're going to blow you up. They immediately assumed that these aliens were here to hurt Earth, which we can very much see as othering. Not only a rival, we can also look at this trend in our short stories. So all of the protagonists who were treated with kind of openness and acceptance, in turn felt understanding and belonging. So your absolute best examples for this are Green, Third and Final Continent, and Exterior Paint. And again, with Exterior Paint, it wasn't the community at large because that was a very hostile, racist community, but with Lillian, that was enough for him. The contrary, the characters who were treated with this kind of suspicion and fear felt in return isolated. They felt misunderstood. They felt very depressed and unhappy. They wanted to go back. They were not happy in their new home. Soldier's Tale, Loose Change, The Thing Around Your Neck, The Embassy of Cambodia. Okay. Please, please remember this. I know I've told you a lot of a lot of things over the last hour, but this is for me what I consider like the most important takeaway from this whole topic on the move is when we have and I'll repeat it real quick, when we have a cross-cultural encounter, we have two options. We can either bridge or we can other. And one is clearly more beneficial for both than the other. The last point here I would really like to pull out is that, we can't ignore the fact that in our short story collection, all of their characters were coming from either Africa, Nigeria in particular, or Southeast or Central Asia, or the Caribbean in Alphonse's case, or Mexico in Shadow's case, and they were moving to predominantly white Caucasian countries, to the US or to the UK, right? Let's not ignore the fact that both the US and the UK, we have quite complicated legacies with racism, still very topical, very current issues. The UK mostly stemming from colonization, and the US mostly stemming from slavery, right? And the legacy that exists till this day. So again, looking at our examples, Alphonse, he in 1965 England, quite frankly, it was bad, but it wasn't as bad as 1965 US. And this is because in the US, racism was codified into law, at least in the South, in the Jim Crow South. Hopefully you guys have learned this over the years in school, right? The series of legal discrimination that was legal in the US. Britain never had it kind of in law. It was more of just in society, this kind of like accepted racism. So for example, Alphonse, to enter the bar where he meets Lillian, he's not allowed to enter through the front door. He has to enter, because he's Black, he has to enter through the side door. So it's more kind of like these kind of societal expectations about how people of color were allowed to act in public. And then I put this up here because I thought it was very interesting. It would have actually been totally illegal in the United States for him and Lillian to get married until 1967. So until 1967, it was illegal for biracial couples to marry. So this is what the civil rights movement was all about, right? Then looking at loose change. So what's interesting about this story is, and it's very subtle. I use this short story in my writing workshop as an analysis of like language. It's subtle the way that the author does it. But in the beginning, the author speaks quite favorably of Layla. She kind of says like, oh, I think she is actually from Spain. And Spain has very like positive associations, right? The women are stereotyped as kind of beautiful and exotic, right? And then she becomes more prejudiced when she realizes throughout the story that she's not from Spain, that she's actually from Uzbekistan. She makes the comment of like, oh, where is that? She's just rarely quite dismissive. Um, and then Southside Raza, I had to laugh because Shadow, he was in the beginning, he was describing like the different neighborhoods and the different kind of communities in California, and he was like, oh, and nobody likes anybody, like kind of racism all around, hate all around, nobody liked nobody. And then the thing around your neck, I think I mentioned this one earlier. This is a really good example of microaggressions. Maybe you guys have talked about this before. So microaggressions, it's kind of sometimes called like casual racism, where it's like it's not this kind of obvious blatant racism, but it's more like these like questions that people will ask that kind of imply like you don't belong, right? And so the thing around your neck, a really good one was the people in the restaurant asking, do you speak English? It's like, okay, yeah, Nigeria is an English colony. Like if you knew anything about the history, of course, you would realize that she speaks English, right? Or do you have real houses back in Africa? Have you ever seen a car before? And the same with Green, her classmates, they're not trying to be racist, but they ask these questions that can be understood as microaggressions because she's like, the little girl, she's an American citizen. She's never been to Africa. She was born in the United States, but they ask her like, what is it like being African? And the little girl is so frustrated by this question, because she's like, I don't know. I've never been there. Why are you asking me? Right? Okay, guys. So the main takeaway, in addition to othering and bridging, like I just told you about, is the most important point. I have to admit, I love this Abby topic because I think it's so relevant, it's so current, it's so topical, it's influencing this topic of migration and dealing with cross-cultural encounters. It is playing a huge impact, not only in politics, but just in our societies, in our communities. Um, you know, what we've seen beginning really in around like 2015, 2016 with, Brexit, which we can understand in part as very much, a reaction to high immigration rates, the first election of President Trump with, AfD in Germany, with Marine Le Pen in France, countries around the world, mostly Europe and the United States. What we're seeing is kind of this ongoing surge and trend of right-wing politics, mostly due to immigration levels. And so I think the reason why this topic was chosen is that they're trying to remind students, and they're trying to remind teachers that there are benefits to multiculturalism. There are benefits to kind of keeping democratic ideals, and that it's such an important role right now that it deserves really a much closer analysis to see, how immigrants can fit in to new countries. What are the obstacles preventing them from integrating? How can this be better managed? How can we aid this? And how can we help people find have a successful immigration stories, because what we see in our story collection here is that sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. And let's find what helped them and try to implement that. So yeah, I hope you guys like this Abby topic. I, as a teacher, really liked it. But that's all I have for you, but we still have like 15 minutes. So I would love to answer any kind of questions that you guys have. I know that just like in my classes, what I tend to do is I get excited and I talk really fast and then I just throw all this information at you guys and don't give you a lot of time to process it. I'm so sorry for that. But if there's any kind of topic that anything related to the Abbey or this presentation, of course, that you would like to talk about, I'm all yours. Let me know. Gonna have a sip of water.
So we don't have any questions yet, but I still also want to give you some time, a few seconds, minutes to process and maybe come up with questions. You have the chance now. Also, as Lauren already said, you can ask questions about things we didn't talk about today.
Sure.
Yeah. As I already mentioned, we will have another presentation on April 14th, same time, 4:30, where we talk more about like the global factors and global perspectives on the topic and migration in general.
Right. That one will be a bit less focused on the short stories, still bringing that in, of course, but looking kind of more globally at different like laws, the politics aspects of it. So we're going to look at what's going on, especially in the United States, the different kind of policies set towards immigration. So that one will be also, I think, very interesting. I'm the one who does it, so of course I'm going to say it's interesting, but it really is.
Yeah. It's also one that is because as I already mentioned, we had those presentations online on YouTube. We took them down at the moment because we have these presentations going on now, and I would prefer to put the ones that we do now back up on YouTube because they will be more up to date. And especially the next one in April, we will be, like updated to all the policies and things that are going on in the US, especially right now, concerning immigration and policies and laws that are.
It changes very quickly. I mean,
yeah.
Policies from a year ago, it's
Yeah.
policies sometimes from a week ago. I'm like,
yeah.
oh my gosh.
It's hard to keep up. I know that because we have presentations on immigration in general in our program, and it's like it's really hard to keep up or to keep track with everything that's happening.
Guys,
sorry, go ahead.
I was going to just say to the Abbey students, I tell all of my Abbey students this, my absolute very best advice that I can give you in the final, stretch here until April, 29th, is if you want to stay up to date, just read, 5-10 minutes every night. Just look at the headlines of BBC. See what's going on, because this topic is, I'm telling you, it's moving so quickly and so fast. And the best way to stay up to date is just browsing those headlines. I don't even say click on it and read the whole article, but at least browse those headlines.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
very fast moving.
Yeah. Just to be aware of what's going on.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. We do have two questions. I'm not
Okay.
100% sure if I understand them 100%, but let's try. So, can there be an analysis wrap up of the short story text or help with analyzing text? I'm not sure if you mean within this presentation, because that's probably too much to do in a presentation like this. We do that within our Abi prep courses, right? Lauren, you do that, like text analysis and analyzing texts and stuff like that. You do that in
Right,
courses, but
right. I mean, I think for this event, yeah, that's a little bit outside of what we're able to accomplish. I have no idea if there's still spots available, but over Easter, we have two writing workshops getting you ready for the written Abby exam starting next week and then the second week of Easter. You can check on our website. I'm not sure, it might be booked up already. But check that out because that is a class that
mhm,
we really do kind of in-depth. We do analysis, exactly how to write, all the different the three different text types that you guys are going to need: the summary, the analysis, and the composition and
yeah,
creative writing. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's my best answer for you. Sorry.
yeah. It's just like that's too much to do within an hour or an hour and a half event.
Yeah.
One other question is, are the downsides of immigration also relevant for the Abitur?
I mean, for all the topics that I can think of, like globalization, immigration, for sure, there's always this kind of like, what are the pros, what are the cons? What are the advantages, what are the disadvantages? And almost like gun control, right? Like almost always you're going to have the argument and the counter argument. And so absolutely you should be familiar with those. Um, I would say that kind of the lesson that I take away, though, that they want you to learn is that in terms of immigration, um, that what we learn from the short stories and Arrival is that immigration is not overwhelmingly harmful or negative, that there is value to multiculturalism. But yeah, to answer your question, always go in to your Abby prepared to argue both sides.
Yeah.
For sure. For sure.
Okay, we have more questions. That's good. So
Okay.
let's keep them
Mhm.
coming.
Yeah.
Why is there a distinction between migrants who migrate from poor countries to rich countries and those who migrate from rich countries to other wealthy countries?
Right. Guys, I'm not saying that this is in any way kind of fair. It's just a term that has been used over the years. I think the term expatriate, expat, I think it first started probably like in the 1950s when people temporarily moved abroad for work, like kind of like rich white guys moved abroad to work in Europe. So like a year for example. But just over time, it's been used, and it's not, I don't think it's in any way like an official term. It's just used by those who are to say like, oh, I'm an expat, like I'm an American expat. If you look on, any kind of social media, Facebook groups, there's like American expat group, Irish expat group, British expat groups. Um, uh, I don't know. It's just one of those things that kind of like started and then people still use the term. But I mean, for sure, if you want to be honest about it, It's not fair. It implies the stereotype is that we're kind of like the good immigrants, right? The rich white immigrants. It's a loaded term and it's very controversial, but
Mm.
just bringing it to your attention that this word is used, and this is kind of the meaning behind it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One more. I don't know if that is something we can answer in short here, but also coming back to like the writing and
Mhm.
what is the best way to combine the short stories with the current policies in a written text?
Just by using examples. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to answer this question without kind of like looking at a specific task. But, if I'm just trying to think like if it's something, let's say American Dream, for example, where it's like you have a text and then you have to say analyze something about like what are the challenges that migrants in America nowadays feel with achieving the American Dream or something like that, right? Then what you could do is bring in examples from the short stories to support your argument. To say that, nowadays in America, if you want to live the American dream, you need to earn $100,000 per year on average to live that kind of middle class life, a house, two cars, two kids, etc. And then you could support that by saying, our character from the third and final continent, he was working at a prestigious university, he was able to buy a home, et cetera, et cetera. Right. And then you could contrast that by saying, people who are working in low salary positions such as waitressing in restaurants, like Akuna and the thing around your neck, that they struggle to financially support the American dream, right? So I guess it's just always using the examples when possible to support your arguments, that whatever the point that you're trying to make, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's what I would have said, or what I would say, to focus on the argument or your
Hmm.
task, and then bring in the short stories or the film as examples to
As
support your
examples,
argument.
right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Um, One question that goes a little, we kind of doesn't really have to do with the presentation, but it's a genuine question. He mentioned that. So, are the Epstein files relevant in the Abitur? I don't know if you know that actually, if that is something that they would
Ooh,
ask about, but
I mean, honestly, I'd be a little bit shocked if they brought up the Epstein files. I mean, I'm just trying to place it in this context of kind of migration, cross-cultural encounters. I don't see it coming up, but look, I'm going to be on YouTube now for a year saying, and then you guys are going to write me angry emails saying there was the Epstein files. Um, Personally, I would be shocked if that was relevant, but I think just as a person in the world, staying up to date with what's happening, that this is something that you should just kind of know about. You don't have to get, crazy in depth with it, but just in general, it's playing a major force right now in not only American but UK politics, Prince Andrew, Peter Mandelson. Right. So it's a huge story. So know about it, but you don't have to, go down the rabbit hole and the conspiracy theories of trying to, understand the whole thing behind it. Just in general, that this guy was, a pedophile and was running a human trafficking ring, and that there was a lot of people in positions of power who were participating. That's mostly what you would need to know, I assume.
I think I have no idea like if that actually could come up. Maybe ask your teachers what they think, if they feel like that is something you need to know about. But also I
Mhm.
think, like, especially in the context of like this topic of immigration,
Mhm.
and I don't really see it as a major topic that
Right.
they would ask about. But yeah. Okay, so we don't have any more questions at the moment. So I hope we answered all the questions, and we helped you a little bit with your ABI preparation, and your, like your studying, through trying to summarize it a little bit for you, and work out the important points. So thank you, Lauren, so much for
My
doing this again.
pleasure. Thank you guys for joining me this afternoon and listening to me talk the whole time. Hope it helped.
Yeah, we hope it helped. And if
Yeah.
you want to come back for the other presentation on April 14th, you're more
Mhm.
than welcome. As we said, we will talk about more, current policies then, and also try to summarize that topic for the ABI a little bit.
Right.
As I said, I will send out the YouTube link to everyone who had signed up for today, as soon as we have it online. We always have to cut it a little bit, and then we will get that information from us as soon as we have it online. Okay, so no more questions came in while I was talking. So
Yeah.
we have 1 minute to 6. That's pretty good. Thanks,
Pretty good.
everyone.
Pretty good.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
Lauren, again for this insightful talk. And hope to see everyone again and have a good evening.
Yep. Thanks, guys.